In this video, we will talk about supply. Now, let's define supply first. Supply is the quantity of goods and services that the sellers would want to supply at different prices. Right now, this is about sellers' behavior. And so, when you think from the seller's point of view, you ask a seller, how would the seller react in terms of how much the seller would want to supply, given they are offered higher prices? What would be their want to supply? What happens to their want to supply? Now, when you offer a higher price to the seller would want to increase their supply because it gives them higher profit. More higher prices would mean higher profits, and higher profits increases their incentive to supply. And when prices are lower, it lowers the incentive for the sellers to supply, and hence they would supply less. Now, this relationship between price and quantity supply can be represented by what is known as law of supply. The law of supply is basically just capturing the behavior of the sellers. And how does the sellers behave? Well, price and quantity supplied, QS, are positively related. When prices are higher, quantity supplied is higher. When prices are lower, quantity supplied is lower, right? Because of the profit incentives. Of course, there are other factors which affects this behavior, but we are for the time being assuming constant when we look at the relationship between price and quantity supplied. We don't want every other factors to influence our analysis. Now, how can one represent this law of supply? There are several ways one can think about putting this in a framework. One can put as a part of table. Then one can have a graphical look at it, and then one can also think about putting it in a mathematical relationship. So here's a table which, when we put the law of supply in perspective of a table, we get what is known as a supply schedule. So the law of supply is basically a relationship in price and quantity supplied. So here's an hypothetical scenario of different prices, and we would want to see how would the sellers react as far as change in prices are concerned. So when prices go down, right, when prices go down from 10 to 8, it means less profits for the businesses or the sellers or the suppliers or the producers, whatever is the name you want to use, and hence lower profit would mean they would want to supply less. So as price goes down, um, the sellers would want to supply less. Right? And so I'm making these numbers up, of course, just to make our life simple. I'm keeping it even. There is no reason for us to always believe that they behave linearly, but to keep the matter simple, we see that when prices are going down by 2, the supply is also going down, quantity supply is also going down by 10 units. Right, so that's one way to put things into analysis. The other way to put this exact same relationship is to look at a graphical representation whereby you have price on vertical axis and quantity supplied on horizontal axis, and then we are just plotting exactly the same numbers that we have in the supply schedule. So when it's 2, we supply 0, and then as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. So when you plot these points and join them, you get what is known as the supply curve. Obviously, the supply curve is upward sloping because the relationship is positive. Then one can think about putting this into a mathematical form, right? And here we are again interested in the relationship in price and quantity supplied. We know it's positive, right? We know it's positive. Um, and all, if we just take the same numbers, the vertical intercept is 2, and every time we have a $2 increase in the price, the supply goes up by 10. So this is zero point 0.2, which is the slope. Okay. And so all the three things, supply schedule, supply curve, and supply equation, are just three different representation of the law of supply, which is basically capturing a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now, this is as far as the individual supplier is concerned. One can then think about how does one come about the overall market supply. And this would be a simple summation across all the individual supply curve. For example, let's say we have a price of 6, right? And the seller 1 is willing to supply, say, 20 units. the seller too at the same price may be interested to supply 22 units, and hence if we have a market which has only two sellers, then at price 6 the total market supply will be 42, which is the sum of individual supply at that particular price. So that's how we can get the market supply from the individual supply that we just talked about. Now, of course, supply depends on a whole host of factors and not just the price. So this we label as determinants of supply. These are all the factors that affects supply. Remember, we assumed several other factors to be constant. These are all the factors which affects supply, but those are not prices, right? So everything other than the price. So what are these factors, right? Let's take a couple of them and then see how does it impact the supply. So cost of production, right? Cost of inputs, everything that goes in manufacturing something, the cost of it does affect how much we end up producing. So for example, let's say you have a situation where you have to pay higher salaries to the workers who are working at your shop. So, if you have a coffee shop and the person who is serving coffee asks for a raise, and let's assume you do that, you give that person a raise, then what happens to supply? Now, of course, because the cost of making the coffee is going to be more expensive, it is going to mean less profit, and hence, because there is less profit, you would want to supply less, right? And hence, we would want to supply less, and the curve will shift left, right? So less would be represented by a left shift of the curve. Take another example, technology. Say you have improved technology to make cars, right? So if you think about supply of cars, say today, uh, and if the technology improves over next 10 years, which is what typically would happen, then better technology would allow us to supply more number of cars for the same amount of time, or given everything else is held constant. So improved technology allows us to supply more, and this can be captured by shifting the supply curve to the right. Right? Notice quantity is measured on a horizontal axis, and more of quantities would mean a right word shift of the curve, and less quantities would mean left shift of the curve. Right? And so in this way, one can just think about what happens if there are more number of sellers. More number of sellers would mean that more will be produced. If the government gives you tax subsidies, then you will have more profits, and hence you would again supply more. Um, or if you have to pay higher taxes as a business person, then you would want to supply less because it means there is less profit. And so one can think about a whole host of factors in this way, and put that into perspective of this supply curve, which is basically all these things will affect supply, which means it's going to shift the supply curve, graphically speaking.